In the summer of 1947, an old warship was being towed to her death. For 30 years, she had survived everything the enemies of Britain could throw at her. 15 German shells at Jutland, bombs over Crete, a Nazi-guided missile at Salerno. She had been hit, holed, and set ablaze more times than any ship in the Royal Navy. She had earned more battle honors than any vessel in British naval history. Now stripped of her guns and dignity, she was being dragged to a Scottish scrapyard to be cut into razor blades. But HMS Warspite was not finished yet. When the storm came, she would make one final, defiant statement, a statement that would cement her legend forever. This is the story of the Grand Old Lady. The name, Warspite, had already been written in glory long before the great battleship was ever conceived. 6 ships had carried the name since the age of Elizabeth I, when Sir Walter Raleigh sailed the original Warspite as his flagship against the Spanish Armada at Cadiz in 1596. By the early 20th century, the name had accumulated 10 battle honors across 3 centuries of warfare. But it was the 7th Warspite, a revolutionary killing machine of steel and fire, that would eclipse all her predecessors. On the 31st of October 1912, workers at Devonport Royal Dockyard in Plymouth laid down the keel of a new kind of battleship. She would be the second vessel of the Queen Elizabeth class, a design so advanced that naval architects called it the first true fast battleship. For centuries, warships had been forced to choose between speed and firepower. The Queen Elizabeth's would have both. Her dimensions were staggering, 643 feet long, 90 feet across the beam, a displacement of more than 32,000 tons, the weight of a small town, all of it clad in 13 inches of hardened Krupp armor. But it was her guns that made men catch their breath. 8 15-inch rifles arranged in 4 twin turrets capable of hurling shells weighing nearly a ton to targets 20 miles away. These weapons had been ordered straight from the drawing board, an enormous gamble pushed through by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. No prototypes, no testing, just a leap of faith that the design would work. It was a gamble that would pay dividends for 30 years. On the 26th of November, 1913, with Churchill himself in attendance, she slid down the slipway and into the waters of Plymouth Sound. 15 months later, in March 1915, she was commissioned into the Royal Navy under the command of Captain Edward Philpotts. Her motto, chosen from the Latin, seemed almost prophetic: Belli dura despicio. I despise the hard knocks of war. She would have ample opportunity to prove it. Within months of her commissioning, Warspite had already developed a reputation, though not the one her designers intended. Twice in her first year, she suffered embarrassing mishaps: a grounding in the River Forth, a collision with her sister ship Barham in heavy fog. Some whispered that she was unlucky. A jinxed ship. The damage to her hull was repaired, but whispers are harder to fix. Then came Jutland. On the afternoon of May 31, 1916, Warspite steamed into the North Sea as part of the 5th Battle Squadron, attached to Vice Admiral David Beatty's battlecruiser force. Ahead lay the largest naval battle in history, a clash between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet that would involve more than 250 warships and 100,000 men. But here we must pause and ask a question that would hang over the next several hours like a death sentence. Could the revolutionary Queen Elizabeth-class battleships withstand the punishment of modern naval warfare? Their design was untested in combat. Their armor was thick, yes, but the Germans had developed new armor-piercing shells capable of devastating destruction. 3 British battlecruisers would be blown apart that day, their magazines detonating in catastrophic explosions that killed thousands. Would Warspite share their fate? The answer came in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. As the 5th Battle Squadron turned north to join the main Grand Fleet, German shells began finding their targets. One struck Warspite's port wing engine room. The damage seemed survivable. But something far worse was about to happen. At approximately 18 minutes past 6 in the evening, with Warspite steaming at 25 knots, her steering gear jammed. Captain Philpotts had ordered a turn to port, but the thrust bearing on the steering engine overheated. The helm went over too fast, and suddenly, The 32,000-ton battleship was spinning out of control, heading directly toward the entire German battle line. In the chaos of that moment, Philpotts faced an impossible choice. He could stop his engines and try to regain control, which would leave his ship dead in the water, a stationary target for every German gun in range, or he could maintain speed and pray. He chose to keep moving. What followed became known as the Death Ride. Warspite executed 2 complete circles, 720 degrees of helpless rotation, in full view of the German high seas fleet. Every battleship, every cruiser, every gun that could bear turned its attention to the crippled British vessel spinning before them. The shells came in salvos. 1, 2, 5, 10, 15 heavy-caliber hits tore through her superstructure. 150 holes were punched through her hull by fragments and secondary fire. Her rangefinders were destroyed. Her fire control systems went dark. 3 of her 4 turrets lost the ability to train on targets. Yet, still she fought. Able seaman Charles Pocock would later recall the carnage. Splinters were flying everywhere. Men were being cut down all around me, but the guns kept firing. We kept fighting, because that's what the Warspite does. And here, in the midst of catastrophe, emerged an act of sacrifice that would become legend. The armored cruiser HMS Warrior had been caught in the German crossfire, hit by at least 15 heavy shells. She was burning, flooding, dying. Over 700 men were trapped aboard a doomed ship. Then, Warspite appeared. Her wild, uncontrollable circles carried her directly between Warrior and the German guns. The enemy, presented with a larger, more valuable target, shifted their fire. For 10 desperate minutes, Warspite absorbed the punishment that would have finished Warrior. And in those 10 minutes, the crippled cruiser managed to limp away. 743 men owed their lives to Warspite's misfortune. Finally, the engineers regained control of the steering. The helm answered once more, and in the gathering twilight, Warspite slipped away from the German guns, her hull riddled but her heart still beating. 14 of her men were dead. 32 were wounded. Among them was Warrant Officer Walter Yeo, whose face had been so badly damaged that he would become one of the first patients in history to receive reconstructive plastic surgery. The journey home was almost as harrowing as the battle. German submarines fired torpedoes at her twice during the night. One passed so close that lookouts could have touched it. Another submarine surfaced directly in her path. Warspite tried to ram it but missed by mere yards. When she finally limped into Rosyth the following morning, the locals were dressed in mourning black. They had heard only rumors of disaster, of battle cruisers exploding, of a British defeat. They assumed ships like Warspite had run away. They were wrong. When the full story emerged, the whispers about her being jinxed transformed into something else entirely. This was a ship that refused to die. A ship that had sailed through hell and brought her crew home. The Battle of Jutland gave Warspite her first battle honor. It would not be her last. The Great War ended with Germany's high seas fleet interned at Scapa Flow, escorted there in part by the ship they had tried so hard to destroy. Warspite settled into peacetime routine. Fleet reviews, Mediterranean cruises, the quiet life of an aging battleship in an era of disarmament. But the damage from Jutland had never been fully repaired. Her steering remained temperamental, prone to failures that her engineers learned to work around but could never completely fix. She ran aground in the Aegean in 1927. She was rammed by a Romanian passenger ship in fog off Portugal in 1933. The whispers of bad luck returned. Yet when the Admiralty looked at their fleet in the early 1930s, they saw something that others missed. Warspite's hull was sound. Her guns were still among the finest afloat. With investment, she could be reborn. Between 1934 and 1937, she underwent a transformation so complete that naval historians called it a virtually new warship. Her entire superstructure was demolished and rebuilt. Her 24 coal-fired boilers were ripped out and replaced with 6 modern oil-burning units. Her gun turrets were modified to increase their elevation from 20 to 30 degrees, extending her range by 9,000 yards. Anti-aircraft batteries were added. A catapult and aircraft hangar were installed. New fire control systems, new armor, new engines. The cost was £2,363,000, nearly as much as her original construction. But when she emerged from Portsmouth Dockyard in 1937, she was ready to fight a new kind of war. She would not wait long. On the 3rd of September, 1939. Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. Within months, Warspite found herself racing toward the frozen waters of Norway, and a battle that would demonstrate her devastating power to a new generation of enemies. The German invasion of Norway in April 1940 had caught the Allies off guard. At Narvik, a vital iron ore port in the far north, a flotilla of German destroyers had landed troops and overwhelmed the Norwegian defenders. A British counterattack on April 10th had been costly. 2 destroyers lost on each side. Captain Warburton Lee killed, earning a posthumous Victoria Cross. 8 German destroyers remained, trapped in the fjord with dwindling fuel and ammunition. The Admiralty decided to finish them. Vice Admiral William Whitworth hoisted his flag aboard Warspite and led a force of 9 destroyers into a fjord on the morning of April 13th. What followed was a masterclass in naval destruction. But first, a remarkable event that deserves its own moment in history. As Warspite entered the fjord, she catapulted her ferry Swordfish floatplane to scout ahead. The biplane, an obsolete-looking design of canvas and wire, droned through the narrow corridor of mountains with clouds pressing down like a ceiling. Its crew, Observer Lieutenant Commander Brown, pilot Petty Officer Rice, and air gunner Leading Airman Pacey, had orders to spot targets and report enemy positions. They found something better. Anchored in Herjungsfjord, just 50 yards from shore, lay the German submarine U-64. The Swordfish dove to 300 feet. Brown released 2 250-pound bombs. The first struck the submarine's bow directly. Pacey raked the conning tower with machine gun fire as German sailors scrambled for safety. Within 30 seconds, U-64 was gone. It was the first submarine in history to be sunk by an aircraft in combat. A footnote, perhaps, in the larger sweep of the war, but a glimpse of the future nonetheless. The Swordfish wasn't finished. Minutes later, it spotted a German destroyer hiding in ambush, positioned to fire torpedoes at the approaching British force. Brown's warning allowed the lead destroyers to engage immediately. Warspite's 15-inch guns completed the destruction. Then came the main event. Chief Petty Officer Fred Jones, captain of B Turret, left one of the most vivid accounts of what followed. For us, the Battle of Narvik begins with the order, action stations. The gun crews take up their positions. We hear, all guns load, and up come the gun loading cages with a thud. The controller barks, salvos, and the right gun is brought to the ready. The fire gong sounds, ding, ding. The right gun fires and recoils as a woof rocks the turret. The roar of Warspite's guns reverberated off the snow-covered mountains like thunder trapped in a canyon. German destroyers tried to run. Some fired torpedoes that raced toward the British ships, only to explode harmlessly against the fjord walls when they missed. One by one, they died. Erich Koellner, destroyed by torpedoes and 15-inch shells. Dieter von Roeder, hit by Warspite, forced to scuttle. Erich Giese, sunk in a hail of fire from multiple ships. The survivors retreated into the narrow Rombaksfjord, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, then scuttling their own vessels rather than surrender. By nightfall, 8 German destroyers had been destroyed. Over 1,000 German sailors were dead. The Kriegsmarine had lost half its destroyer strength in a single day, a blow from which it would never fully recover. Warspite earned her second battle honor. When King George VI visited liberated Norway after the war, he presented her ship's wheel to King Haakon VII as a symbol of Anglo-Norwegian friendship. Today, it hangs in Narvik City Hall, a reminder of the day the grand old lady came calling. But the hardest trials were yet to come. In the summer of 1940, Warspite returned to the Mediterranean as flagship of Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, a man as uncompromising as the ship he commanded. Italy had entered the war, and the Regia Marina presented a genuine threat to British operations in the region. On the 9th of July, off the coast of Calabria in southern Italy, the two fleets met. Cunningham pushed Warspite ahead of her slower consorts, racing to support his cruisers as they dueled with Italian heavy cruisers at long range. For several critical minutes, Warspite found herself effectively alone against 2 Italian battleships, Giulio Cesare and Conte di Cavour. The Italians opened fire. 2 shells from Giulio Cesare splashed dangerously close to Warspite's hull. And then something extraordinary happened. At a range of approximately 26,000 yards, nearly 15 miles, one of Warspite's 15-inch shells found its mark. It struck Giulio Cesare's rear funnel, punched through the steel, and detonated inside. The blast tore a hole 20 feet across. Smoke flooded into the boiler rooms, choking the engine crews and forcing 4 boilers offline. 26,000 yards. It remains one of the longest-range hits by naval gunfire on a moving target in recorded history. The Italian admiral, uncertain of how badly his flagship was damaged, ordered a withdrawal. The Regia Marina would never again seriously challenge British supremacy in the Mediterranean. But Warspite's finest hour in those waters was still ahead, and it would be written in blood and fire on a March night in 1941. The Battle of Cape Matapan began with a deception. British intelligence had learned through ultra-intercepts that an Italian fleet was preparing to intercept Allied convoys between Egypt and Greece. Cunningham knew the Italians would be watching his movements, so on the afternoon of March 27th, he made a conspicuous appearance at the Alexandria Golf Club, carrying a suitcase as if settling in for a leisurely evening. A Japanese consul known to be passing information to the Axis watched him arrive. After dark, Cunningham slipped away to his flagship. The fleet sailed at dusk. What followed the next evening would be called the Royal Navy's greatest victory in a fleet action since Trafalgar. The Italian heavy cruiser Pola had been crippled by an aircraft torpedo earlier that day. Unaware that British battleships were closing rapidly, the Italian admiral sent 2 more heavy cruisers, Zara and Fiume, along with 4 destroyers to rescue their stricken sister. It was a fatal mistake. At 10 minutes past 10 on the night of March 28th, radar operators aboard HMS Valiant detected the Italian ships at just 6 miles range. The Italians, lacking radar, remained blind. Cunningham's battleships, Warspite, Valiant, and Barham, closed to 3,800 yards, point-blank range for 15-inch guns. Searchlights snapped on, their beams stabbing through the darkness to illuminate the enemy. Among those operating the lights aboard Valiant was a young midshipman named Prince Philip, the future Duke of Edinburgh. What the Italian sailors saw in that blinding glare must have been terrifying. 3 British battleships, guns already trained, ready to fire. Warspite's log recorded the action with cold precision. 22, 25:30, enemy in sight on starboard side. 22, 27:15, turrets loaded, ready, on target. 22, 27:55, open fire with broadsides. 22:28:00, hit secured on first cruiser, bursts into flames along full length. The destruction was absolute. Warspite fired 2 broadsides at Fiume and 4 at Zara. In just 10 minutes, she discharged 40 rounds of 15-inch ammunition and 44 rounds of 6-inch. British gunners watched in disbelief as main turrets weighing hundreds of tons were blown dozens of meters into the air from the shattered Italian cruisers. Within 5 minutes, both Fiume and Zara were blazing wrecks. The destroyers Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci joined them at the bottom. The crippled Pola, unable to flee, was sunk by torpedoes after her crew was taken off. Italian losses: 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2,400 men, including Vice Admiral Carlo Cataneo. British losses: 1 aircraft and 3 crew members. The psychological impact on the Italian Navy was devastating. For the rest of the war, the Regia Marina would operate with extreme caution, unwilling to risk another massacre. Naval historian Corelli Barnett called it the Royal Navy's greatest victory in a fleet encounter since Trafalgar. Yet even the grand old lady was not invulnerable. In May 1941, during the brutal Battle of Crete, Warspite found herself serving as a floating anti-aircraft battery, her guns pointed skyward against waves of German bombers. On the 22nd of May, a 500-pound bomb struck her starboard side. The explosion killed 38 men, wounded 31 more, and ripped open the ship's hull. Her 6-inch guns were wrecked, 1 boiler room flooded. Her speed dropped to 18 knots. For any other ship, this might have been a death blow. For Warspite, it was merely another chapter in a long story of survival. She limped to Alexandria, then embarked on a remarkable journey halfway around the world, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, past Ceylon and Manila, through Pearl Harbor. Finally arriving at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard in Washington State for repairs. She was there when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She was there when America entered the war. And when her repairs were complete, she sailed west again, back toward the Mediterranean, back toward the fight. By September 1943, Italy had surrendered, but the war in the Mediterranean was far from over. German forces still occupied much of the peninsula, and Allied troops were fighting their way north through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. Warspite was called upon to support the landings at Salerno, and there she would face a weapon unlike anything she had ever encountered. The Fritz-X was a 3,000-pound guided bomb controlled by radio from the aircraft that dropped it. It was the world's first precision-guided munition, a technology decades ahead of its time. German pilots could steer it toward their targets with a joystick, adjusting its trajectory as it fell at speeds approaching 770 miles per hour. On September 16, 1943, Warspite was bombarding German positions around Alta Villa Silentina, when 3 Dornier bombers appeared at 18,000 feet, well beyond the effective range of her anti-aircraft guns. What happened next would test everything the grand old lady had learned in 30 years of war. The first Fritz-X struck near her funnel. It punched through 6 decks before detonating in the No. 4 boiler room. The explosion blew out her double bottom, creating a hole 20 feet by 14 feet in her hull. A second bomb near missed, holding her at the waterline and flooding a 5th boiler room. Within minutes, Warspite had taken on 5,000 tons of water. All steam was lost. All power failed. She listed 5 degrees to starboard and drifted helplessly, smoke pouring from her wounds. 9 men were killed, 14 were wounded. For the first time in her career, Warspite was completely helpless, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to do anything but wait for rescue or death. American tugs found her and took her under tow. For 3 days they dragged her toward Malta, praying that German aircraft wouldn't return to finish the job. They didn't. Warspite reached Malta on September 19th, but the damage was catastrophic. Her X-turret would never fire again. No. 4 boiler room was sealed with a concrete caisson, effectively abandoned. One of her propeller shafts was permanently disabled. Any reasonable assessment would have retired her from active service. The Admiralty had other ideas. After months of makeshift repairs, the grand old lady was pressed back into service for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, Warspite took her position off the Normandy coast. Her 6 operational 15-inch guns, 2 turrets were all she had left, were trained on the German battery at Villerville. At 5 o'clock in the morning, HMS Warspite became the first ship to open fire on D-Day. The thunder of her guns signaled the beginning of the liberation of Europe. For the next 48 hours, she pounded German positions, bunkers, and gun emplacements with relentless fury. Her captain announced over the ship's address system, "All personnel not on full action stations can come up on deck to witness a sight you will never see again in your lifetime." Overhead, waves of gliders carrying the British 6th Airborne Division passed toward their landing zones. Warspite fired over 315-inch shells in those first 2 days, more than she had fired at Jutland, at Narvik, and at Matapan combined. When her magazines ran dry, she withdrew to Portsmouth to rearm, then returned to support American forces at Utah and Omaha beaches. On June 13th, steaming through the Straits of Dover for the first time since the war began, she struck a mine. More damage, more repairs, more defiance. She returned to action in August, bombarding German coastal batteries at Brest. In September, she helped reduce Le Havre. In November, she fired her last shots in anger at Walcheren Island, helping to open the vital port of Antwerp. Then, finally, the guns fell silent. On February 1, 1945, HMS Warspite was placed in reserve. Her engines were worn out. Her guns were eroded from 30 years of service. Her hull bore the scars of shellfire, bombs, mines, and missiles. Proposals were made to preserve her as a museum ship, a floating memorial to the men who had fought and died aboard her in 2 world wars. But post-war Britain was bankrupt. There was no money for sentiment. The Admiralty ordered her sold for scrap, And here we return to where our story began. On the 19th of April, 1947, two tugs, Bustler and Matinda III, took Warspite under tow and began the long journey from Portsmouth to the shipbreakers at Faslane, Scotland. On her decks was a skeleton crew of 8 men, there to manage her during the voyage. 3 days later, 15 miles off Land's End, the storm hit. It came out of the Atlantic with terrible force, the kind of storm that reminds sailors why they fear the sea. Waves crashed over the old battleship's deck. Wind howled through her empty superstructure, and sometime in the darkness of April 22nd, the hawser connecting her to Bustler snapped like a thread. Matinda III tried to hold on. She couldn't. Her tow line slipped away. Warspite was free. Through the night, the old ship drifted toward the Cornish coast. Her crew dropped anchor in Mounts Bay, hoping to hold position until help arrived. The anchor didn't hold. On the morning of April 23, 1947, HMS Warspite ran aground on Mount Mopus Ledge near Cudden Point. When the tide rose, she lifted free, only to drive hard aground again, this time in Prussia Cove, her bow underwater and her stern pointing toward the Atlantic she had crossed so many times. An old Cornish fisherman who witnessed her arrival described the scene. "Aye, the old Warspite do lie there pointing towards Prussia Cove. I mind the night she came in, broadside on and terrible to see. There was a high wind and powerful seas, and none could hold her." The Penlee lifeboat, under coxswain Edwin Madron, launched into 25-foot waves to rescue the skeleton crew. The 8 men had to time their jumps perfectly, leaping from the heaving deck to the lifeboat as it rose and fell beside them. Madron received the Royal National Lifeboat Institution's silver medal for the rescue. Every man was saved, but Warspite herself was finished. Multiple attempts to refloat her failed. In 1950, salvage crews tried pumping air into her compartments with 24 compressors. A rising gale drove one of the rescue tugs onto the rocks and fouled another's propeller. It was as if the sea itself had decided where the grand old lady would rest. Eventually, she was towed a few hundred feet closer to shore and beached at Marazion, within sight of St. Michael's Mount. From 1951 to 1955, she was broken up where she lay, her steel cut into scrap, her timbers salvaged for souvenirs, her great guns silenced forever. A newspaper of the time captured the poetic justice of her end. Her oldest loves, the wind and the sea, have helped the old lady of the fleet to cheat the executioner. She is ashore, apparently for good. One of her former crew members put it differently. She was eventually broken up where she lay by British workmen doing what the enemy failed to do. Today, almost nothing remains of HMS Warspite. Her ship's wheel hangs in Narvik City Hall. Her chapel door and a gun plug are displayed at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth. A few fragments of her boilers still lie buried in the sand at Mounts Bay, too heavy to remove. But on the headland between Prussia Cove and Cudden Point there stands a memorial made from her own timbers, and at Marazion a stone marker was unveiled in 1992 by surviving members of her crew. The inscription reads, HMS Warspite 1915 to 1945, ran aground and broken up on these rocks 1947, her final haven, known to all who served aboard her as the Grand Old Lady. May she with many gallant shipmates rest in peace. Every autumn, members of the HMS Warspite Association make a pilgrimage to that memorial. They lay a wreath, they dip their ensign in salute. They remember. What made this ship so special? The numbers tell part of the story. 15 battle honors, more than any ship in Royal Navy history. 2 World Wars, 30 years of active service. Combat actions from the North Sea to the Norwegian fjords, from the Mediterranean to the English Channel. She fought at Jutland, Narvik, Calabria, Matapan, Salerno, and Normandy. She survived 15 shell hits in a single battle, bombs, mines, and a guided missile. But numbers alone cannot capture what Warspite meant to the men who served aboard her. She was not merely a machine of war. She was a living presence, a vessel with a character as distinct as any sailor's. Her steering was always temperamental, a legacy of Jutland that her crews learned to work around. Her engines were demanding, her hull scarred, her guns worn smooth by decades of firing. Yet, she always came back. She always fought. She always endured. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, who flew his flag from her bridge during some of the most desperate hours of the Mediterranean War, gave her the name that stuck. After a high-speed operation in 1943, he signaled, "Operation well carried out. There is no question, when the old lady lifts her skirts, she can run." The Grand Old Lady. It was a name that captured something essential about her, the combination of dignity and ferocity, of age and vitality, of grace under fire that defined her character. She was old, yes, but she was magnificent, and she refused, to the very end, to go quietly. Her motto had promised as much, "Belli dura despicio," I despise the hard knocks of war. For 30 years, she proved it. In February 2019, the Ministry of Defense announced that the third of Britain's new Dreadnought-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines would carry the name Warspite. When she enters service in the 2030s, she will be the 8th Royal Navy vessel to bear that ancient name. The announcement quoted the original Warspite's motto and noted that she truly lived up to its promise. But no ship, however advanced, can replicate what the Queen Elizabeth-class battleship achieved. She was forged in an age when naval warfare meant steel against steel, when ships closed to point-blank range and slugged it out until one side sank. She fought through the transition from dreadnoughts to aircraft carriers, from cordite shells to guided missiles, from the age of empire to the age of superpowers. And through it all, through Jutland's death ride and Narvik's thunderous fjords, through Matapan's midnight massacre and Salerno's terror from the skies, through D-Day's liberation and the storms of her final voyage, she endured. The Grand Old Lady of the Royal Navy, the most decorated warship in British history, HMS Warspite. May she rest in peace.